Decades after the sinking, the first sight of the Titanic still triggers the same reaction. How could a ship this massive vanish and still remain here, almost unrecognizable, yet somehow still present? The camera cuts through the darkness of the Atlantic, and little by little the bow emerges once again into the light, covered in rust, sediment, and the scars of a century on the ocean floor. This is not just wreckage, it is structure, scale, and absence, all in the same frame. And that's when the question hits. How many signs from that night are still hidden among these broken sections of the ship? Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me what part of the Titanic amazes you most. The bow, the personal belongings, the cabins, or the debris scattered across the seafloor. From here on, the exploration stops being just a visual impact and starts becoming a reading of the hull itself. The camera moves along the forward section of the Titanic to reveal something old photographs never truly captured: the real size of this structure resting on the ocean floor. The steel plates appear twisted, the railings have been eaten away, and the bow still commands respect even after decades of corrosion. It is a powerful contrast. On one side, the grandeur of the design; on the other, the slow, relentless, almost brutal ruin. And there is one important detail here. Every break on the outside already begins to show how the ship aged, collapsed, and was gradually rewritten by the sea. Now the tone of the exploration shifts. Instead of simply circling the ship, the camera starts looking for real entry points, rupture zones, openings torn open by the violence of the sinking and by more than a century of decay. This is where the curiosity tightens for real, because every gap suggests a real possibility of going deeper into the story. Some areas are badly warped, others have been partially defeated by corrosion, and many no longer exist as they did in 1912. Even so, certain access points still allow for visual reading. The question now is no longer just where to look, but through which paths the Titanic still lets us in. At this point, the Titanic changes scale. From the outside, it still looked like a colossal structure defeated by the sea. In here, it begins to feel like a place that was once used, crossed, and lived in. The camera enters accessible sections and reveals broken corridors, corroded metal, bent columns, collapsed ceilings, and traces of decoration still stubbornly showing where each room once began. It is not a clean view, and it is not complete. And maybe that is exactly what makes it hit so hard. Because once these interiors appear, the ship stops being just wreckage and becomes an abandoned human setting, frozen at the exact moment everything was cut short. After the corridors and structural remains, the camera starts finding an even more revealing layer: the small objects. This is where the Titanic stops speaking only through its architecture and starts speaking through routine. Scattered dishes, fragments of furniture, warped utensils, and details that would normally seem ordinary begin to carry much greater weight on the ocean floor. Because these items are not impressive on their own, they matter because of what they suggest together: daily use, order, service, human presence. And let's be honest, sometimes a common object found in the wrong place says more about that night than a massive rupture in the hull ever could. As the camera moves forward, the traces stop looking like random leftovers and begin to function as clear signs of human presence. These are not grand objects. They are marks of use, routine, and passage. A fallen container, a single shoe, service pieces, small items scattered across the floor. All of it helps us understand who moved through these spaces and how life on board was organized before the collapse. And that is the key point. The Titanic does not preserve only matter. It preserves behavior. Every detail found here suggests movement, function, urgency, and absence. It is almost like reading people through the things they never had the chance to take with them. In the private areas, the reading of the Titanic becomes even more concrete. The camera finds cabins and compartments where the layout of the space still shows through, even after being distorted by collapse and time. There are recognizable divisions, furniture crushed by pressure, decorative details that survived in fragments, and sections where the destruction was far more aggressive. That contrast helps reveal something important. Preservation here is not uniform, and that is exactly why each space offers a different kind of clue. In some places, it feels like total ruin. In others, you can almost picture how that room once worked before the water swallowed everything. From here on, the Titanic begins to be read less through structure and more through the personal traces left behind along the way. Crushed suitcases, separated shoes, containers, accessories, and loose belongings start pulling the focus because they may look small, but they change everything about how this site is understood. They do not only explain what existed on board, they suggest who was there, what they tried to preserve, and what was abandoned when time ran out. And there is something deeply powerful in that. The more personal the object, the less the ship feels like a distant setting, and the more it reveals real lives interrupted at full human scale. Now the camera truly slows down. Instead of searching for grand halls or obvious ruptures, it starts observing the smaller, stranger, almost unlikely details, the kind you might miss on a first pass. This is the archaeology of detail: a fragment of porcelain, a worked metal piece, a bent accessory, an ordinary object preserved in the exact place where it was left. And it is fascinating how it works. Sometimes one nearly trivial item gives more context than an entire wall. Because detail forces you to look carefully, compare, imagine use, position, and purpose. This is where the Titanic begins to speak quietly, but with far greater precision. When signs of luxury begin to appear, the Titanic reveals another layer of its identity. These are not great halls left intact, nor perfect images of the past. They are fragments of refinement surviving unevenly on the seafloor. Porcelain, crafted metals, decorative finishes, and remnants of ornamentation emerge covered in corrosion, sediment, and marine growth, yet still recognizable enough to reveal the level of sophistication this ship once embodied. And that is what makes it so striking. Even in decay, the luxury still shows. Only now, it no longer impresses because of comfort or status, but because of the brutal contrast between elegance and collapse. At this stage, the Titanic no longer functions only as filmed wreckage. It starts acting like a material archive. Every object, every fragment, and every position in space helps reconstruct routes, habits, uses, and even decisions made in the ship's final hours. The remains do not reveal everything, of course, but once placed in context, they answer a great deal without needing a single witness. It is almost like a raw puzzle, except this one is assembled with real matter. And as you follow this reading of the ship, go ahead and comment on which object found here intrigues you the most. Leave a like and subscribe, because the next blocks go even deeper into this reconstruction. From here on, the exploration becomes harder to read and far more visually honest. The camera enters denser, darker, more compromised sections, where the Titanic no longer presents itself in clear forms, but in warped volumes, narrow passages, and structures that seem to have collapsed on top of one another. Sediment covers entire portions of the interior, corrosion erases outlines, and understanding what each space once was takes real care. And that matters, because not every part of the ship offers easy answers. In many places, what we are seeing is not a ready-made scene, it is fragmented evidence, confused, and brutally incomplete. When the camera begins crossing broader rupture zones, the Titanic starts to read almost like an engineering problem scattered across the ocean floor. The arrangement of the debris, the orientation of the steel plates, the buildup of objects, and the way certain compartments gave way all help reveal the logic of the collapse. Nothing here explains everything on its own. It is the combination of structure and trace that begins to make sense. A group of objects out of place, a line of deformation, a void where continuity once existed. Everything becomes a clue. The broken ship does not show destruction alone. It shows, in fragments, how the rupture happened. This is where the Titanic stops being read only as a broken structure and starts hitting head-on through what was left behind. The camera finds traces that stand out not because of grandeur, but because of absence, deteriorated personal belongings, preserved groupings that feel unsettling, items that still seem tied to an interrupted gesture. There is no exaggeration here, no visual trick. The impact comes from the opposite. The more ordinary the object, the harder it becomes to see it as simple. Debris. Because in the middle of all this ruin, those are the details that bring the sinking back to human scale. After that impact, the reading changes. The question is no longer only what the camera found, but what the position of those objects, their condition, and the surrounding space allow us to conclude responsibly. One isolated item suggests one thing. A preserved group in the same place suggests something else. Proximity to corridors, cabins, rupture zones, and circulation areas starts to matter just as much as the object itself. This is where the investigation gets more serious. Because the Titanic does not answer in clean, ready-made statements. It answers through context, distribution, contrast, and permanence. And that demands a colder eye after the emotional shock. After the peak moment, what becomes strongest is not the isolated shock, but the logic of abandonment. The camera finds objects that do not seem stored, arranged, or protected. They were simply left behind, and that changes everything, because what was left does not function like a collection of curiosities. It functions like evidence of urgency, interruption, and choice under pressure. One item dropped along the way, another trapped in a corner, another left near an exit. They all suggest movement broken in the middle of action. Here the Titanic is not speaking only of what sank, it is speaking of what there was no time to save, carry, or finish. Now, the difference between space, class, and preservation begins to appear more clearly. The camera moves through areas that were not used in the same way, did not hold the same objects, and did not leave behind the same traces. That helps reveal how life on board was structured, who moved through certain corridors, what kind of environment held more comfort, where service was more intense, and how all of that still appears today on the ocean floor. And that contrast is deeply revealing. Because the Titanic did not sink as one uniform mass. The ship's social divisions also remained distributed throughout the ruin, sometimes subtle, sometimes impossible to miss. In certain sections, the Titanic still preserves enough lines, proportions, and volume for the space to begin making sense again. Not completely, of course, but enough to be readable. A wall division, the curve of a passageway, the position of a piece of furniture beaten down by time, a finish surviving in part, all of it helps reconstruct, at least mentally, how that environment once functioned before the rupture. That is where the reading of the ship becomes deeper, because it stops being only scattered ruin and starts revealing layers, what it was, what remained, and what can still be recognized through corrosion, silence, and loss. But there is one unsettling fact in all this. The Titanic is not simply preserved on the ocean floor, it is still changing. Corrosion advances, structures give way, details disappear, and places recorded in earlier expeditions no longer appear the same in more recent images. That changes how the ship is studied, because every record captures not just a historic wreck, but a specific stage of decomposition. In other words, part of what was once seen has already been lost. And that continuing loss gives every object, every room, and every recognizable form a kind of urgency. There comes a point when the Titanic demands more caution than certainty. Not every object explains the context in which it ended up there, and not every spatial arrangement allows us to conclude exactly what happened. Some things can be stated with confidence. Others depend on comparison, probability, and technical reading. That is the line between evidence and hypothesis. The problem is that the invisible remains vast. Decisions never recorded, routes without witnesses, moments that left no clear mark behind. In the end, part of the story can be reconstructed. Another part remains out of reach, even when surrounded by traces. When these traces begin to be observed together, they start answering without needing a voice. Everyday objects, fragments of luxury, and signs of human presence stop being loose pieces and begin functioning as parts of the same historical puzzle. But that puzzle never fully closes. Context is always missing, displacement always exists, and there is always some margin of doubt. Even so, certain patterns appear with force: use, movement, social contrast, abandonment, and interruption. That combination is what makes the Titanic so powerful as material evidence. It does not hand over a ready-made narrative, but it offers enough fragments to build one carefully. At this point, the reconstruction begins to approach what no one was ever able to witness in full that night, but the method remains the same: no invention, only traces, context, and responsible inference. The position of certain objects, the interruption of interior routes, and the proximity between circulation areas and abandoned items all help suggest urgency, movement, and shifting priorities in the final minutes. Even so, there is a clear limit. These signs do not show the whole scene. They show material fragments of what happened, and maybe that is exactly what makes it so powerful. The ship reveals a great deal, but it never reveals everything. In some sections, what weighs the most is not what remained, but the emptiness. Corridors, compartments, and passageways that once depended on constant movement now exist as hollow, corroded, interrupted volumes. There is no longer any clear sign of use, only architecture stripped down to its essentials, defeated by water and time. That material silence is powerful precisely because it reveals the lost function of each space. Places built for service, movement, rest, and gathering now remain, motionless, with almost no immediate identity left. And it is in that absence that the interior of the ship takes on another weight, not as a setting, but as an abandoned human shell. When all is said and done, the Titanic preserves far more than metal and destroyed compartments. It preserves traces of behavior, differences in use, marks of routine, signs of hierarchy, and above all, the effect of abrupt interruption. That is why the objects matter so much. They are valuable not only for what they are, but for what they are able to record: movement, function, context, and absence. A simple item can reveal more than a massive structure when it remains connected to the right place. And maybe that is this ship's rarest historical power, turning material traces into physical memory of lives, choices, and spaces cut short. Even after decades of exploration, the Titanic still resists any sense of complete answers. There are traces that suggest routes, choices, uses, and even sudden changes in behavior, but many of them stop halfway. Continuity is missing. Context is missing. The final link that would turn indication into certainty is missing. And that incompleteness does not weaken the story. In fact, it gives the ship a rare kind of force, because every gap keeps open a space for responsible doubt. What survived helps reconstruct a great deal, but it also makes one thing clear. Part of that night remains out of reach, and perhaps always will. When these spaces return in the final stretch, the reading is no longer the same. What once looked like just a corroded corridor, an empty room, or an abandoned object now carries context, function, and absence. It is almost like returning to the same traces, but now with the memory of everything they revealed along the way. A sign of everyday use no longer feels trivial. A decorative fragment no longer speaks only of luxury. Everything gains historical weight because it is now seen as evidence of interrupted life. And that return ties the experience together beautifully. The Titanic does not change, but the way we see it changes completely. In the end, the Titanic does not stand only as an underwater ruin. It remains as a material archive of interrupted moments. Every object recovered, every space still readable, and every absence that resists explanation helps reconstruct not only the disaster, but the human experience that existed inside that ship until it was cut off without warning. That is what makes these traces so powerful. They speak volumes about routine, hierarchy, urgency, abandonment, and loss. But they never tell the whole story. And maybe that is the most haunting part of all. After more than a century, the ship still offers enough evidence to be understood, and enough silence to keep haunting us.